Now let's turn to the second topic of the podcast, which is the process of becoming bilingual. In other words, the process of acquiring the second language. We need to consider there are two different modes, two different ways in which that process can happen. We can become bilingual through the process of language acquisition. Language acquisition is what happens when infants learn language, regardless whether it's one language or more of them. So it occurs through natural modalities and through social interaction, through their family, through the community, and the kind of learning that occurs here is implicit. Rather than being explicitly taught names of concepts, these people are simply extracting from the context and the interaction what the meaning is, and they are acquiring language through this implicit learning method. The other mode of language learning is explicit language learning. It occurs through formal tuition, explicit learning, and is typically something that happens in the institutional setting, such as a school or an evening class. And now I'm going to focus some more on this second process of becoming bilingual, language learning, because that's where our insights can inform educational practices and allow people who need, for whatever reason, to acquire more languages, whether it's simply for fun, whether it's for work, to be able to do that in a more effective way. Now let's look at how the process starts. What does it mean to learn a language once we already mastered one of them? To learn a language, we start off by linking new word forms to the concepts we already know. We have conceptual knowledge about the world around us, and then we have the words that map onto those concepts, and we use them to communicate with people around us about our experiences of the world. Let's look at this diagram that tries to illustrate this point. You will see that here you have conceptual store that would have the abstract knowledge of, say, concept dog, that will map our knowledge about all the different kinds of dogs we may come across in our life as being a dog. And this concept is going to be activated when we see a dog, when we see a picture of one, but also when we read a word dog printed on a piece of paper. What happens if somebody decides that they want to learn, say, Spanish, and they go to a course, and they now learn that a word in Spanish for dog is perro? Traditional view is that what happens at that point is that we start acquiring associative lexical links between the form in the native language, say English in this example, and the new language, which is Spanish in this example. So in order to get to the meaning of dogness from the Spanish word, we need to first mentally translate into our first language in order to activate corresponding semantic knowledge. Now, as we become more proficient, we start forming a semantic link between our conceptual knowledge about dogness and the new form of the word, which is the name for a dog in Spanish. This asymmetry is something that tends to change through learning. So we may even say that there is a developmental shift between the stage when we are starting to learn a foreign language and we are forming these associative lexical links between the words, and we rely on mental translation, and then later on, as we become better in using that language, shifting reliance onto using semantic links, activating meanings of those words directly. There have been many studies proving this asymmetry and this developmental shift, and I'm just going to use one of them to illustrate how it works in practice. I'm going to use a study done by Telemas and colleagues and published in 1999 as one of the examples. In this study, they have used translation recognition task to test how people learn languages and if and when developmental shifts happen. So in translation recognition task, participants are presented with pairs of words, and they have to say if those words are correct translation of each other or not. In their study, they had half of the participants be very fluent, proficient bilinguals, and the other half were people who are just starting to learn Spanish. They had three conditions in the experiment. Naturally, one of them was the correct one, where the words were correct translation of each other, and in this translation recognition task, correct answer to give there would be yes. But then they have two types of incorrect pairings. One of them relied on form similarity. So incorrect translation from English to Spanish didn't have the same meaning, but was very similar in form to the correct word, such as in this example where even though the word looks similar, its meaning is different. It doesn't mean man, it means hunger. And then they had another condition that had semantic similarity between the correct English word and incorrect translation, where they're dissimilar in form, but they're related in meaning, such as in this example where the meaning of the Spanish word is woman. Now the question was not how well they do. What Talamas and colleagues were interested in is how people are going to make errors and when are they going to make those errors. So in other words, they have focused on these two incorrect conditions and wanted to observe what bilinguals at different level of fluency will do in those situations. What they observed is that early bilinguals, people who are not fluent in Spanish, made considerably more errors in the form-related condition than in semantic-related condition, while on the other hand, fluent bilinguals made more errors and they were more confused when there was a link in meaning rather than the link in form. And this experiment demonstrates this developmental shift in relying on associative links early in a learning process to starting to form links with semantics and rely on semantic links later in a process. But the question I would like to ask now, is it really inevitable to go through this associative stage or to stay so long in it? Is it possible to encourage quicker and earlier formations of links to semantics by changing the way we are teaching people? In other words, if we look at this slide, what happens if we are presenting word in English with a word in Spanish for people to learn them? In a way, we are encouraging them to make the links between those words and perform mental translation. In other words, we are almost encouraging them to form associative lexical links. But what would happen if we would map new words with a picture representing a concept and require people learning to make direct link between the new word form and the meaning, as in learning another synonym in your own language, learning that you can say the word for the same concept in different ways? I will present the study I have done recently with my PhD student Shakila Palmer, where we have tried to address that question. To address that question, we had to pick a task that would be sensitive to having a link to semantic. To do that, we have chosen to study something which is known in literature as age of acquisition effect. There is a lot of evidence that words we acquire early in life are processed faster and more easily across a range of language production tasks than words we learn later in life. So the question in this experiment was, can we encourage formation of semantic links between new words and the meaning early after even one single training session, and we would take the presence of this age of acquisition effect as the index of whether that link has been established or not. In our first experiment, we have presented our participants with the pairings between a new made-up word and a picture representing the concept. There were two phases in the experiment. There was a training phase where participants had to learn 30 new pairings between these new made-up words and line drawings of common, well-known concepts. Half of the concepts were the ones that are acquired early in life, other half were acquired later in life. After this brief learning phase, participants went through a test phase where they were given a picture, a line drawing of the object, and they were asked to name that object using newly learned words. And what we have observed is that although, as you can see on this graph, they have learned both kinds of concepts to the equal level of accuracy, there was no difference in terms of errors they made when naming pictures with the new words. There was a reliable difference. They were much faster, they were significantly faster when they were naming concepts that are acquired early in life compared to the concepts learned later in life. Now, what happens if we take the more traditional approach to teaching language and present participants with word-word pairings, which we did in the second experiment? So in a way, it has followed exactly the same procedure as the first one. Is just that in a training phase, participants were presented with pairs of words, like here, bam and egg, and they had to learn that bam is a new name for egg. And after they went through a training phase, they had exactly the same test phase where they were presented with pictures of objects, such as egg, and they had to use a new word to name them. So if they see egg, they should say bam. What we observed there is that there was no advantage to early acquired words over late acquired words. In other words, the benefit from gaining link to early acquired concepts was lost when participants were learned through associating words together. So what can we conclude based on this study? Well, first we can conclude that easier acquired concepts are easier to learn new names for later in life. We also see that when we are learning vocabulary of a new language, it is possible to establish link with meaning very early in a process. It's not necessarily something that requires months or years of learning and training to achieve. It can be done quite quickly. But whether it will be achieved quickly or not is reliant on the type of teaching method we use. So if we use teaching methods that highlight and encourage people to use direct link from the new word form to the meaning, that conceptual knowledge and link with the conceptual knowledge will be established much faster and earlier in the process. And in some way, we can even say it will kind of circumvent the need to go through the laborious mental translation one needs to do in early stages of language learning.